not have practiced on a little bit more. But for now, guys, we're into game number one. Mattles, who have we got going?
In the top left position, playing for Root, we have the blue Protoss. He's come and joined us in a couple of show matches to give it his input. It is ToD. And his opponent, down in the lower right, the red Protoss, currently probably one of the favourites tonight. It is Crank.
Yeah, and these players are, of course, incredibly competitive. Now, to my knowledge, ToD has left Root and is currently teamless.
Oh,
so,
is he?
I believe so. At least that's what I was doing. Just a very quick check of all the players on Liquipedia before the start of the tournament this evening. And from what I understand, that is the case. I've been quite busy recently, but I think that's what's going. I'm sure chat will very promptly correct me if that's not the case.
Yeah, I've just checked it up. As well. It was on the 6th of December. I must have missed that through all the excitement of Christmas. But
so
yes.
That will get changed on the overlay soon, guys. Don't worry about it. But PvP, Aquilon Wastes, a couple of very important strategic points in the middle of the map. Note that in the GSL, the two middle watchtowers, so the ones closest to the center, I believe destroy themselves after 7 minutes. And that's because GSL decided that towards the late game, those two watchtowers basically give you vision of so much that it's just a massive favorite for whoever's holding them. So in this version of the map, the towers are intact for the entire game, which means if we go into the late game, the strategic positioning of units around those watchtowers could become key.
Quite right, those watchtowers are so vital, and they're not actually too hard to hold either, because they're isolated up on the high ground, that you really have to forcefully go up there. And the trouble is that if you hold them too well, you can lose some units if you just try and run past them. But lots of different attack paths, lots of places you can hide proxy pylons.
Yeah.
And as a result, there's also basically a lot of ways you can just go about this map. Air is also very viable. It's viable anyway in Heart of the Swarm, so maybe we'll see some quick Stargates to try and punish anyone who's too greedy, but for the time being, they're just going very standard. Cybercore, the second gas down for both players, and no real reveal about anything too exciting quite yet.
Now, a small difference that we saw early on between these two players is that ToD went for 2 gas geysers relatively early, but initially put 2 probes on each. They are now back up to 3 probes, and Crank chose to get his second gas slightly later. So this is really just 2 different routes to almost the same thing. ToD has the slightest bit more gas to play with, but we're talking of something like 20 gas at the moment. Nothing terribly important, but that will allow him to go for a slightly earlier Mothership Core.
Well, we've got the Mothership Core on its way out down for ToD, and this is arguably one of the most defining changes in my mind of Heart of the Swarm. This Mothership Core opens up so much for Protoss players, both offensively and defensively, and as such I'm excited to see how ToD is going to go about using this, what potentially Crank's going to do in response to it, because he's only just starting his own now. But obviously 1 base v 1 base is still very likely, but ToD getting that Stargate down, which is something I thought was quite likely this game, and that's going to be good for him, and it's something we actually saw Wellmu do on Monday.
It is. Wellmu put a lot of faith in his Stargate play, actually. Continuing with it, whether he won or lost, it was a very consistent feature of what was ultimately not a successful play on the night, because he did go down eventually to Verdi. Great spot of that probe, though, from ToD, seeing the forward pylon as well.
That is really important for ToD right now, because that just gives away that actually my opponent is going to be trying to be aggressive. He's pulling that Mothership Core back. He will have enough energy for a photon overcharge, and as such, all ToD has to do now is hold this off cost effectively, and he's actually going to be in okay shape.
He should be doing all right here. The worker supply is currently 25 all. Crank hasn't gone for like a 4-gate or anything like that. It's just 2 gateways into a Stargate, so he's not going to necessarily commit way more than is absolutely necessary. 5 Stalkers moving up the ramp of ToD now, but he has got that Mothership Core, like you mentioned. Photon Overcharge going to be incredibly useful, and there we go, immediately going down on the Nexus, and Crank is going to have to get out for now, trying to snipe away at that Cybernetics Core. One of the Stalkers, though, getting very low as a result.
Now, we've got our first variation in what they're doing with their Stargates. We've got the Voidway coming out for ToD at the moment, but Crank instead going for the Oracle. Now, once that Voidway pops, which will be very shortly indeed, those Stalkers are going to have a lot less fun pushing up here, but they have managed to supply block ToD briefly, knocking out one of those pylons, and little wins like that are always going to equal a snowball effect going into the late game unless ToD really deals with this force.
3 gateways and a Stargate now. Units to defend from ToD trying to pop out pretty quickly. He's managed to get away from that supply block. A Void Ray has now joined in as well. And the Photon Overcharge has actually expired on the next, so that's not helping at the moment. Crank trying to push in with these Stalkers, doing a good job sniping off the Mothership Core, which could end up being a huge win for him there. And as soon as Crank did that, he moves straight out of the base. He feels comfortable with his position right now. The Time Warp not doing too many favors for either side there. And Crank's going to follow up with this Oracle.
This Oracle, if it gets in and if it isn't defended, and with ToD moving out, it's unlikely to be, this can potentially do an awful lot. But I think that it was the right move, actually, by Crank sniping that Mothership Core and pulling out, because that's ultimately 100 gas and 100 minerals. So that is a big commitment. Oh, and as such, he's done a good amount of damage and now can afford to pull back and take his natural.
Here comes the Oracle, picking up probes left, right, and center. 3, 4, 5 dead so far, and counting, 4. Just missing out on the 5th one there as the Void Ray chases it away. A good amount of damage done there, but will he actually get out with it? The Oracle is on a race with these Stalkers. ToD sees the Oracle now, and it looks like it is going to go down.
And Oracles explode in such a nice way, may I just add. Their little green explosions are absolutely brilliant in my mind, but
Fireworks, man.
Fireworks are always good. And yes, what we've got coming down now is just the expansion for both players. We've got ToD now getting out his own Oracle. He's getting higher in terms of the Void Ray count. He's up to 2 compared to the 1 of Crank for the time being. And this is actually where this is starting to look quite level. But even the work count after those 4 were killed, we're still looking at 29 to 27, Jorasa.
Yeah, this has been a very very aggressive game by both players so far. If we take a look, we're actually almost at the 10-minute mark now. If this was a Wings of Liberty game where Protoss is, or just a PB anything where you're just trying to macro up, you're thinking more along the lines of 40 workers by this point, but these guys have been at each other's throats, constantly trying to poke and prod, especially Crank inside the main base of ToD. ToD kept calm, did lose his Mothership Core, but otherwise stabilized, and now both players are in a relatively equal position.
And once you are in this equal position, the right thing to do is actually not try and take too many risks, especially in game 1, because if you're too risky with these units and you lose something too soon, you're going to regret it, because the counter-attack could potentially be very, very strong. But what we see ToD doing here is he's poking up at the natural, but he's sending an Oracle down into the main. That is a great choice in my opinion, and that distraction may allow him to pick off quite a few workers.
Well, let's see the Oracle moving into the main base now, and here we go in the mineral line. 2 getting picked off, and the Phoenixes from Crank very, very quickly dispatching it. 4 workers killed to 3 so far in this game.
So, where does that leave us with the harvest account? ToD 32 of Crank at the moment. That's quite advantageous, actually. That's a good 6 worker lead. And what we see ToD getting behind this is another Stargate up. So he's going into Sky Toss. He's pulling back to be in a more defensive position. But generally speaking... Well,
oh, hello. Sorry. Skype appeared to give us a little bit of a derp just there. Didn't catch the end of that last sentence, Mattles, but I completely agree with you. Sky Toss looks like it's going to be the way to go for both these players. One thing that's worth mentioning from Crank at the moment, though, he has 4 Phoenixes out in addition to a Void Ray, but ToD has gone for pure Void Ray. Now, this could be an interesting dynamic if the teams decide to have a bit of a fight. The Phoenixes, of course, picking off a couple of probes as well, continuing to be annoying, and they have got their superior speed. So in a straight-up engagement, the Void Rays might have a little bit more punch, but Crank is using the mobility of his units very well here.
And that's what you should always do. If you do have a more mobile army, you've got to be harassing, you've got to be poking and prodding, because the second you stop doing that, your opponent will feel comfortable to just come and A-move you. But what we've got now is we've got a push coming up. Crank is going head on, one of those Phoenix, nearly dying. Force fields for both sides, and it looks like for the moment ToD is going to hold, chasing down with that Void Ray. Manages to snipe the... was that the Mothership Core?
I think he managed... Let me just
No, he didn't.
No, both sides still have the Mothership Cores 5.
Must have been a stalker then. So, what we've got down here is ToD with proxy pylons everywhere for the time being. Those Phoenix still trying to be aggressive, just harassing around the side, keeping a good check out. And if we check in ToD's base, he does still have those 2 Void Rays there ready to defend it. So, he's really prepared. He's adjusted how he's playing to deal with them. And now those Phoenix potentially about to go down.
Oh, and they just simply cannot cope with the sheer amount of DPS from these Void Rays right now. Crank doing a good job of rescuing those, but 2 of them on very, very low health indeed, and ToD is going to be putting down his 3rd base at this point. So it looks like ToD slowly now squeezing an edge out of Crank. But behind this, Crank has managed to chrono boost out a couple of pros really well. He's currently leading in worker supply 48 to 43, and he's picking off a couple more workers at the natural as well.
Now, that may not seem like that many, but every couple of workers you kill off there gives you a better lead, and that is what Crank needs to be doing now, because once that third base is up and running, the Crank does actually know about, he is going to start falling behind if he doesn't have his own, because ultimately it's 3 probes at a time against 2. So all while Crank stays ahead, that's really good news for him. Upgrade-wise, they're both only got the +1 air weapons, so very similar in that regard.
And another Forge popping down now for ToD. So, pardon me, first Forge rather. So he's going to be beefing up his ground army just a little bit as well. 3 Phoenixes from Crank coming back into the natural. Once again, picking off a couple more workers and darting straight back out, not attempting to overcommit. And that's really showing in the workers kill tab, because if we just take a quick check of that, Crank has killed 18 workers this game to ToD's 3. But bear in mind, even with that, they're pretty much on dead equal supply.
Exactly, and that is where the problems come for Crank potentially, because he's only 6 army supply behind, but as we see down in the bottom of the map, there's the Mothership Core and a good force of Void Rays. That means that actually ToD can push in, he can snipe off some key structures and then mass recall back should he need to either escape or defend.
Yep, and it looks like ToD is going to be going for this third base. He knows his third Nexus is already up. So potentially he could go in here, ensure that the Nexus goes down. With that many Void Rays, it won't take very long at all, and then mass recall very quickly. But Crank, look at this. He's actually moving back to defend around the third base because he sees no aggressive moves out into the map from ToD. But look how quickly this Nexus is going down. That mass recall has to get used early. ToD was not expecting the entire army of Crank to be there. And while that was a great idea, execution, unfortunately, Crank has anticipated it.
So that leaves us now where Crank is definitely being quite considerably more cost effective than his opponent now. He's managed to only lose 1,000 less resources than his opponent, and as such, I'd say Crank is now firmly economically ahead with an 8 worker lead. He's still going to be on 3 bases equally, and as such, this is going to get a little bit tough.
Yeah, that could have been a game changer for ToD there, as the 3 Phoenix hit squad once again moving out across the map, doing a very, very good job right now. 8 to 5 kills. That's a tremendous amount. 15 kills between those 3 Phoenix so far in this match, and that really could have been a game changer. ToD, if he had picked off that Nexus and simply dropped back with the mass recall, would have forced Crank into some sort of push, because economically ToD would have been very far ahead. But as it stands, you put it really, really well. Crank has just been economically that much more efficient, and the units lost tab rather shows this very, very well. So
both players do now have their fleet beacons out. Both players getting additional Stargates out. And one small thing that I like that ToD has done is mentioning about those Phoenix was exactly right, because they have done a lot of damage, but ToD now with the photon cannons at each mineral line has really shut that down quite heavily, and as such can potentially now come back into the game as long as he gets some good trades, because he's not that far behind in terms of the army supply. Only 2 army supply difference between them, so that's still the point where some good engagement angles will really make the difference.
Yeah, and engagement angles are what it's all about in mirror matchups, especially if you have very similar army compositions as well. Late game, for instance, the difference between having 1 or 2 extra units at a convenient angle really turns the screw in on an opponent, so these guys have to watch their engagements very carefully. And amusingly, ToD hallucinating a couple of Colossi marching across the middle of the map at the moment. Not really sure what this is about, because it's going to be very obvious to Crank that that's not actually what ToD is going for right now.
Yeah, I've just got these 2 Colossi, which I'm going to rally to your third, because that seems like a good move, but it does get in some scouting information, that's important. One thing I did want to pick up on is that actually the air upgrades are now different. Crank's at +2 compared to the +1 at the moment for ToD, and both players are getting the next level of it as well. Crank with the shields upgrade coming out as an advantage means that just with those upgrades, with the greater army supply, with the still better economy, he is just getting ahead in all these different places that could add up to be a big headache for ToD late game.
Yeah, we've got 15 versus 19 Void Rays at the moment, so our screens are destined to be filled with some sort of blue laser beam I don't even know what later on. This battle is going to be absolutely insane when it finally does happen. 3 Void Rays at a time being made by Crank at the moment. ToD, though, has decided that now would be a fun time to switch into carrier production.
I see his thinking there, because if your opponent's committing a lot to Void Rays, then actually if you get some carriers out and you're able to keep them safe at the back, then maybe it's okay. Maybe some Tempest would have been a good move as well, we'll wait to see, but this is the sort of switch up which it makes it less of just a numbers game and more of a positioning and more of a, actually who gets the best engagement, because this is what it's all going to come down to at the end. And ToD, I like that he's switching it up a bit, but Crank getting his Templar archives out, he's really just teching differently as well. So this is going to leave a lot to the question mark in the late game.
Yeah, both players actually treating this mid-game very, very passively. They've both held one of the central watchtowers for a very long time, showing not much interest in grabbing the other one. They're just happy to continue massing up their air army and hover on 4 bases. But sooner or later, a 5th base is going to have to get taken. And ToD right now looking like he might want to sneak a base in at around the 7 o'clock position. There's a probe there with a couple of pylons out. But those pylons are also going to be very, very useful in double checking when Crank takes his 5th as well. And ToD goes for that 8 o'clock expansion.
So, taking the extra expansions late game is really important, but the trouble for both of these players now that they are maxed out with Skytoss is ultimately that if they have a bad engage, they're not going to be able to re-macro up quickly. This is a very slow army to produce, and as such, that's why they're being passive, because they want to do it right if they're going to go in. And that means that once someone commits, they've got to be 100% sure it's going to go their way.
Oh, and we have a carrier out for ToD. We've got a couple of Archons out for Crank as well. The army's very, very close to each other at the moment, but they don't actually know where they are. Crank looking like he wants to see if he can get a piece of this Nexus, and now ToD can see the army here. A lot of Void Rays in this composition, and here we go. Massive base engagement here. Good time warp going down, but is it going to be enough? The carry is providing a good amount of DPS support. Whose supply is dropping faster? It looks like it's ToD's at the moment. He's down to 110 right now as Crank completely powers through the splash damage from those Archons, doing a tremendous amount to bolster.
Now, this is really going to be tough for ToD. If he wants any chance of staying in this, he's going to have some kind of miracle, because there's 22 Void Rays for Crank against just the 4 of ToD. Can those 4 carriers make the difference? I'm concerned that they can't.
And I think you might well be right here. The Void Rays moving in for what looks like could be the final engagement of the game. The army composition for Crank are better at dealing with Skytoss thanks to the addition of those Archons and the 3-1 upgrade popping in a bit earlier. That gives him the GG and a 1-0 lead in this best.